In the heart of the African savanna, beyond the reach of the modern world, there was a small, remote village known as Ngala, a place so hidden by dense forests and winding rivers that it was almost impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. The villagers lived in harmony with the land, following traditions passed down for generations, their lives untouched by the outside world. But Ngala was no ordinary village. In this strange, mystical land, something impossible was happening. The men were getting pregnant. It started slowly, with rumors trickling through the village, and then it became undeniable. Women whispered, their eyes filled with fear and wonder, while the men stared at their bellies in disbelief. There were stories of the curse, passed down from an ancient, forgotten time when a great betrayal angered the spirits of the earth. The villagers had long forgotten the details, but the curse was still very much alive. One day, the first man in the village, Afalabi, began to complain of strange pains in his stomach. He laughed it off at first, thinking it was nothing more than indigestion from the rich palm wine he had drunk the night before. But when the pain intensified, he couldn't ignore it any longer. His body, once firm and muscular, began to swell with an unfamiliar weight. His wife, Nia, was the first to notice. She screamed, and soon, the entire village gathered at their home. As the days passed, Afolabi's belly grew larger and larger, and rumors spread faster than wildfire. The village healer, Amina, was called upon to examine him. She was a wise woman, known for her knowledge of herbs and ancient rituals. After a careful inspection, she confirmed what no one wanted to believe. "A curse," Amina whispered in dread. "The spirits have returned to punish us." The village's elders called an emergency council. The men, old and young, had all begun to show signs of the curse. It wasn't just Afolabi. Every man who had crossed the threshold of adulthood in the village was afflicted. Some were frightened, others confused, and a few tried to ignore it altogether. But there was no denying it, the village was cursed. The elders gathered around a fire and summoned the spirit of Mwenya, the ancient ancestor who had protected their people for centuries. Her spirit was said to reside in the sacred grove just beyond the village, a place where no one dared enter without her blessing. Through the smoke of the fire and the rhythmic chants of the elders, Mwenya's spirit manifested. She appeared before the gathered villagers, tall and regal, with skin that shimmered like the stars and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly fire. "The curse you bear is the result of a betrayal long forgotten," she said, her voice echoing in the air like thunder. "Long ago, your ancestors broke a sacred vow. They desecrated the land and defiled the spirit of nature. In their greed, they took from the earth more than it could give, and in doing so, angered the gods. To this day, the men of this village are bound to carry life in a way that is not their own." The villagers trembled, knowing that the spirits of the earth were not to be trifled with. Mwenya's spirit turned to the men, her gaze sharp as a spear. "You are not to be the fathers of children, but the vessels of creation. Until the curse is lifted, you will bear the children of the earth, and in doing so, you will understand the pain of life's creation." With that, she disappeared into the night, leaving the villagers to grapple with the horror of their reality. Over the weeks that followed, the village of Ngala descended into chaos. The men's pregnancies were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Their bodies changed in strange, unnatural ways. The women, too, were caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Some were filled with pity and fear for their husbands, others with an eerie sense of power, for now they were no longer the only ones who could give birth. But the curse had taken a toll on the village, and their crops began to fail. The once fertile lands seemed to dry up, and sickness spread among the people. Even the sacred river began to recede. Desperate, the villagers sought a solution, but no one knew what could be done to lift the curse. The elders called for another gathering, this time to consult the wisdom of their ancestors in the ancient texts kept hidden in the village's sacred temple. The scrolls told of a ritual that could reverse the curse, but it required a sacrifice so great that it could only be carried out by a man who was willing to give up his life to restore balance. Afalabi, the first man to fall pregnant, could not bear to see his village suffer any longer. He had already felt the deep, unshakable bond between him and the child growing within him. It was as though the earth itself was using his body to carry out its will. But in his heart he knew that the only way to save his people was to carry out the ritual. The elders performed the sacred rites in the dead of night under a blood-red moon. Afalabi stood at the center of the village, his pregnant belly swelling more than ever as the chants grew louder and the fire burned brighter. The air was thick with anticipation. As the ritual reached its climax, Afalabi felt a sudden, searing pain unlike anything he had experienced before. His body convulsed, and he cried out as something deep within him began to break free. In that moment, the curse was lifted. The pain subsided, and the earth seemed to breathe again. The crops began to sprout from the dry soil, and the river flowed once more. But Afalabi had paid the ultimate price. As the ritual completed, his body, now empty, collapsed to the ground. The earth had claimed him as its own. His sacrifice had saved the village, but it had also cost him everything. The village of Ngala was forever changed. The men no longer carried the weight of pregnancy, but the scars of the curse remained. The women, now forever grateful to the men for their sacrifice, took up new roles in the village, honoring the memory of those who had suffered in silence. And Afalabi's name was etched into the hearts of the people as a hero, a man who had carried not just the weight of a child, but the weight of an entire village's future. Though the curse was lifted, the villagers knew they could never forget the strange, unnatural years that had changed their lives forever. And deep in the forest, at the edge of their village, the sacred grove remained, its trees whispering of the old magic that could never be fully erased.